So welcome again, everyone. My name is Karibuhoye Said from the MAVA Foundation. I'm the director of the West Africa program for the foundation. I will be facilitating this session. So I was saying that we are in a time where we need to have more impactful conservation action, where we have to be more efficient, where we need to be more efficient. We need to be to have really more results. And one of the things you will hear today is really how to use evidence in conservation. So this is a webinar that is organized by Foundations of Success together with MAVA Foundation and Conservation Evidence. Indeed, this is a timely session, I think. The aim of this session is to talk about practical steps to really learn, to have evidence-based learning. We want to see what evidence says about widely known and widely used conservation practices and strategies, but today we will be focusing on capacity building as one of the themes. And also we want to reflect on what the results from this study did show us. And we will see also indeed how we can use this to improve even this learning practice. So I want to also say that we will have a very interesting agenda. We will have an introduction by Lynda Mansson from MAVA Foundation, and then we will have a presentation on the need for evidence in conservation. We will then have a Q&A session. Then we will have a presentation on the approach that was used in this initiative, and also on some of the results regarding the capacity building strategy, followed by a Q&A session again, and then we will be hearing about some reflections from the philanthropy sector, and also by Julien Semelin from the Cartier for Nature. And then we also hear from Daniela Aschenbrenner from CCNet. So, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lynda Mansson. Lynda has been the Director General of the MAVA Foundation since 2010. Lynda is deeply invested in developing the leaders of the world, and she is, now that the foundation, MAVA Foundation, is wrapping up, Lynda is going to be really acting, and she's already acting as a certified and accredited coach. And before she joined the MAVA Foundation, Lynda was actually working with the WWF for 13 years in Switzerland. So Lynda, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Charlotte, and hello, everybody. Pleasure to see you all, those that I can see. As Charlotte introduced, I'm the CEO of the MAVA Foundation. In case there are some of you who don't know MAVA, we are a family philanthropic foundation and have been grant making on nature conservation and sustainable economy for the past 3 decades. We've been going since 1994, and we are now closing. We ended our grant making last year, and we've got a few more months to wrap things up by June of this year, and then we will have exited this space. So as we're approaching those last days for us, we're very focused on harvesting and sharing our learnings, and hopefully leaving a legacy for others, leaving something that others can use and find beneficial. So after 3 decades in this space, we really wanted to mine the treasure trove of data and evidence that we have in our archives, and complement that with information that's already out there, other evidence, other sources, other literature. It's really important for us to be able to learn across our portfolio and then share that widely. So this is why we initiated this piece of work that turned into the Conservation Learning Initiative. We started conversations with the Foundations of Success, who have been a strong partner for us throughout the whole design and implementation of our final phase, and also with conservation evidence. Luckily for us, they're the ones who did the heavy lifting here. We initiated and funded the work and helped to shape it along the way, but they really are the ones who made this happen. So I'd like to thank both of those organizations for all of their investment in what we have come up with to date. So we hope to inspire others with the findings and that there's something useful in there, but we also hope to inspire others to use evidence in their own practices and decision-making. And whether that's about improving grant making, using adaptive management better, forming powerful partnerships, or having more impact in the field. So my hope for this session is that you find something useful that you can take away and apply in your own practices. And that for us at MAVA would be considered a big success. I wish you an excellent webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynda. I think that we will now hear from Nick and Bill. We will have presentations on framing the need evidence in conservation. Nick Salafsky is Executive Director of the Foundations of Success. He is also the Program Manager for Miradi software, for those among of yourselves who know the Miradi software. Bill Sutherland holds the Miriam Rothschild Chair in Conservation Biology in Cambridge University. His book, Transforming Conservation, a practical guide to evidence and decision-making, is available open access. Thanks, Bill. He's determined really to make the conservation and other subjects more effective. So Bill and Nick, over to you.
Thank you. I'm starting and then moving over to Nick. I just want to say how wonderful MAVA is and how wonderful Cartier is, as they're coming later, and also what a joy it has been working with our friends at FOS. So I'd like to make 8 points. Firstly, that not using evidence is a bit of a disaster. So my history is that I was a naturalist, and then I became interested in practical conservation because I just cared about the natural world. And then increasingly, I did more and more conservation work as part of my academic work. And then some time ago, in the 1990s, I thought it'd be interesting to work out how do you learn about conservation. So I edited this book, Managing Habitats for Conservation, in which I got lots of practitioners to say, what should you do if you're managing a forest, managing a grassland, managing some coast? And there's lots of good stuff in there. But the thing that really struck me is you didn't really know what to believe and what not to believe, because most of it didn't. It just said, this is what you should do. And that rather worried me. And a number of other things worried me. We did various tests of the effectiveness of conservation management activities. And we showed time and time again that many of the well-accepted techniques just didn't work. And then when you look to see what the basis of them was, you found sometimes there was no science underpinning them, and they just became standard accepted beliefs, although there was really no basis to that. And then there are other concerns. So in evidence-based medicine, they've done tests of that, and they've shown that if you do that, then the mortality rate is lower by 19%. That's massive. Surely we want that. And there's lots of disasters in conservation. So in the European Union, we've had lots of agri-environment schemes where we've said ahead of time, this isn't going to work, this contradicts the evidence, but we weren't listened to, and measures have been taken place, which turn out not to work. And we've spent billions of euros as a result of not using the evidence, money that we could have saved and used more efficiently. And when you ask practitioners how much more effective we could be, how much money we could save, almost everyone sort of says about 50%. We could be twice as effective, we could be twice as efficient, or we could deliver twice as much for the same money. That seems to me really key. So there's a serious problem. But other subjects have actually gone a long way to solve this. So there are 3 that I think are leaders. There's medicine, obviously, evidence-based medicine, which greatly influenced me. And that's been a real success. And if you ask how it's delivered by providing information that practitioners can use, they can look up and decide what to do, but especially it's produced by guidance, a sets of guidance which you can look up and it'll say the standard treatment for this problem is you do this. And that's largely what doctors do. The second is flight safety. So the number of accidents is tumbling whilst the number of flights is increasing enormously. So the accidents per flight has plummeted massively. And they have two techniques. So when there's an accident, sometimes they just change the design. So they work out, the pilot got confused in this way, so let's make it less confusing. And that's fantastic. And the other thing they do is they have checklists of processes. And then the third example is engineering. So buildings fall down less than they used to. And the technique they have there is they have standards. If you're going to build a bridge, this is the standards. And unbeknown to you, those standards are based on looking at the evidence and doing calculations. So it's evidence-based, but you as a builder are unaware of that, but it's very effective. So those are the sorts of processes by which you can convert science into practice. And a revolution is taking place. So funders increasingly asking what the evidence base is. As very kindly mentioned, we produced this book, and there's lots of interest in that, lots of people around the world. And evidence-based conservation and evidence-informed conservation are becoming mainstream. More organizations are saying they're becoming evidence-led. It really is making a difference. So what do we say you should do? There's kind of two approaches. You can do a systematic review where you take a subject and then review the literature on that. The approach we adopt is called subject-wide evidence synthesis. We take a big topic. So we've taken mammal conservation and we've said, what are all the papers that relate to the conservation of mammals? And we do this in a systematic way. So we've read 1.5 million papers in 17 languages. But by doing that at scale, it makes it enormously more cost effective. Each review just costs us about £1,000. So you can then have that evidence sitting there. So what do we suggest people do? We suggest that they weigh and assess each of the different bits of information. So the tool we have at no expense spared, we use this cube in which we ask, what's the quality of the information? What's the quality of the source? And what's the relevance of the information to your particular problem? So by taking each piece of evidence and then assessing the accuracy of each piece of evidence, you can then put those bits of evidence together. And then what we're interested in doing is saying, having got that evidence and put all of that evidence together and weighed it to see whether or not you believe it or not, you want to embed it into processes. We want to embed it into evidence-based management plans, embed it into the funding decisions that individuals make. And that if we do that, we'll be considerably more cost effective. So, and then the other thing we want to do is have people embed experiments within practice. And finally, we produced lots of checklists in order to tell you how to be much more efficient and deliver these changes. So what we're saying is that there's serious problems with conservation, but that we can deliver evidence-based conservation, and we have the tools to do that. What we need to do is to find ways of delivering that at scale and make sure that we can do that. And Nick Salafsky's going to tell us how to do that. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So I'm going to share a little bit more, building on what Bill said about a framework for evidence-based conservation. Unlike Bill, I'm going to share a few slides, so hopefully you can see my screen. And we're going to talk about a framework for evidence-based conservation. So this comes from a material I'm going to share, comes from a bunch of different sources. An article I worked on with Bill and many others about defining and using evidence in conservation practice. some work we did with the Canadian Park Service on a practical approach to assessing evidence for specific strategies, and in a book that we've recently published called Pathways to Success. And in that, we talk about defining evidence and what evidence actually is, some key terms. So an assumption, evidence only makes sense in the case of an assumption, something that we believe to be true about a question of interest. And for that evidence, that could be a problem diagnosis. So if we're working at a site, it might be that rats are a cause of seabird nest predation at our project site, and we want evidence for that. Or it might be about the effectiveness of an intervention. So maybe boat rat barriers are effective in preventing rats from recolonizing seabird breeding islands. And these are both assumptions that we can test with information both from our site and from the rest of the world. So evidence is the relevant data, information, knowledge, and wisdom used to assess an assumption. And then evidence-based conservation, as Bill talked about, is appropriately using available evidence base to answer questions of interest needed to improve, or in other words, to increase the probability of good decision-making in conservation practice. As Bill said, there's a slight technical difference between evidence-based conservation or sometimes evidence-informed conservation. So we talk about this pyramid where we start with the basic data about what's going on in the world, about our conservation projects, the targets, the threats, the actions. We can then report on that, and those reports are reports of maybe single case situations, or it could be collections of case studies, or even randomized controlled trials and experiments, but that's the information that we have. We can then bring that into reviews and syntheses, but as Bill talked about, we really need to turn it into summarized guidance. It's the wisdom about the conditions under which practices are effective that makes it useful for people. And so really evidence synthesis is this process of taking all that case study information at the bottom of the pyramid, synthesizing it and turning it into knowledge or maybe even wisdom. And then it's not enough that that wisdom is collected. The key is it actually has to be used to inform ongoing practice. And so it's this cycle of synthesis and then use of the information. Along the way, I want to introduce a couple concepts. We can talk about a specific action. So let's say we're working on a beach somewhere in the Bahamas and we care about sea turtles, and we're setting up a community of guards. So they're going to guard the beaches. And our theory of change says if we do that, effective guards will be deployed. The guards will catch the egg collectors. Their presence deters the egg collectors. As a result, illegal egg collecting is reduced and we have increased sea turtle nesting success. So that's one specific project, one specific set of evidence. We could go to another part of the world, and let's say we're working in Africa on pangolin protection. And in this case, we're setting up community ranger patrols. Again, if the patrols are deployed, the patrols apprehend the poachers, their presence deters the poachers, illegal pangolin poaching is reduced. So we're in a totally different part of the world, totally different culture, totally different species, totally different people. And yet the underlying logic of what's going on is similar. And we're also learning about the conditions under which this works. Maybe if the poachers are coming with AK-47s, our community patrols can't stop them. But if the poachers are nearby neighbors, then in that case, this would be a successful strategy. So we can take that and create what we call then a generic theory of change, which harvests all that specific information and provides guidance on how to think about this kind of a strategy or approach. We can come up with generic objectives and indicators. And if we publish that in something called CAMEL, for example, then that becomes available guidance for the rest of the world. And next time someone wants to use a community patrol and guard strategy, they can learn from what everyone else has done. So CAMEL is a library of all these different kinds of generic actions. There's some very, very simple ones. And we can also do much more complex actions. We have a series in the Journal of Conservation Science and Practice where we're looking at very more complicated actions like jurisdictional sourcing. So where does all this knowledge come from? What this napkin shows is a sketch from a bar conversation I had with Bill and Andrew Pullen and a few others in 2008 at a conference. And this bar sketch turned into a whole theory of change about how to have evidence-based conservation. So we want to have evidence generated. We need to have access to evidence, and we have to have use of evidence. So in particular, evidence must be first generated, it must be accessed when needed, and then it has to be ultimately used. And there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do to make this whole thing work. So there's a lot more detail here, which I won't go into too much of it, but if you start here, we have to have ongoing project evidence reliably and systematically documented. The evidence has to be harvested, compiled and made accessible to others, and then the project evidence is analyzed to create generic evidence. Then practitioners have to be able to assess it, They need frameworks and tools to match evidence with users. They access the right evidence on a timely basis. They use evidence in their projects. Projects keep and start taking actions that are supported by evidence, and they stop taking actions that are not supported by evidence. And then we get to more effective conservation actions. So that's the whole work. These yellow things are the things that we can do to change that world. And in particular, we need to think about the synthesis of experience, and we need to think about the dissemination of experience. So there's a bunch of different evidence libraries in conservation that are out there running. So Bill talked about conservation evidence. There's the CEE, the Collaborative for Environmental Evidence. There's something called Evidencia, which is looking at market-based solutions. And there's all these groups that are looking at primarily reviewing the literature and seeing what the academic literature says about doing conservation work. But here's the challenge in conservation. If we go back to this pyramid where we want to take case study in evidence and synthesize it and then make it useful for practice, that whole review of the published literature is a small fraction of the overall case experience. And it's almost like the bottom of that pyramid on which everything depends is not visible. It's dark matter that's only available in orgs' internal records, in field notebooks, or not even documented. And so if we really want to get the knowledge and wisdom, we need to figure out how to work with practitioners, how to learn, and how to tap that evidence. And so what we're hoping to share with you in the rest of this initiative is the Conservation Learning Initiative, which is trying to meet this challenge. And so we'll turn it over to the other folks to share what they've done. It's not replacing the academic kind of reviews that we've seen before. It's complementary, and we need to bring both of those things together. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to, I think, a Q&A session.
Yeah, thanks, Nick and Bill, for this very insightful presentation. I'm afraid we won't have a lot of time for Q&A session, but I see there is a question from Tobias Garstelsky, who is asking a question to Bill, you know, on whether the quality of evidence would be independent of the quality of source. Bill, if you could really, in 1 minute, try to answer that question, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question, Tobias, and you're exactly right. So we're talking about our cube. So this is the quality of the observation. So are there photos or a description? And then this would be, how experienced is the person? Do we trust that person? Or similarly, if it's some scientific literature, we would say, is this a well-designed experiment? Is this a randomized replicated controlled experiment or not? And then, is this someone with an agenda, or are they independent? So very often you can view those independently. And we think those three measures, what we call the ISR score, information source relevance, is a very good way of assessing almost any bit of evidence. And then you can put those together. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would like now to introduce the Conservation Learning Initiative. You know, I think that Lynda has already mentioned that this is really an initiative that was launched, you know, based on MAVA, almost 30 years of experience trying to really make use of the results from the portfolio of MAVA, but also trying to encourage other people to work really using evidence. So this initiative was then implemented together with Foundation of Success and also with conservation evidence. The most interesting thing to know here is that FOS, as we say, FOS Europe has been a very important technical or partner to MAVA. We work together, you know, to try to implement the adaptive management in our programs. We work together to implement the strategy partnerships, conservation partnerships. And so FOS has a very good knowledge of the MAVA portfolio. So it was really important to actually to work with them on that. Another thing is that we have also been able to take advantage of conservation evidence, also experience in terms of working on conservation evidence, as you have already heard now. And the idea was really to actually to dig into the MAVA portfolio, to identify a few conservation strategies, and also then to try to see what does the evidence from the MAVA portfolio tell us, and what does the evidence from the wider literature also tell us. So that's how we work together. We have also had a very large team on that. So the team was composed of two groups: the implementing team, which is really a group of people who have been working exactly on the matter in terms of proposing the learning strategies, in terms of identifying the learning from that. And we had also a steering committee that has been instrumental to make sure that the learning initiative is really done taking into consideration not only MAVA's priority, but also the needs of the wider conservation community. So that was a very, very, these were very intense, times. But I think that it was also challenging actually to have, and I think that Nico will come to that together with Will. They will also show how challenging it is to get actually relevant evidence from the information you have. So, and I think that the very interesting thing to say also about this initiative is that it was interesting because we had 2 or 3 partners complementing each other, MAVA with the whole portfolio and the information and experience, FOS with the knowledge of the MAVA portfolio, but also the capacity to work on the learning, and also then the conservation evidence with all the expertise in terms of, digging into what has been published in widely to take out also some learning. So I would like now to give the floor to Nico. Nico will be actually presenting together with Will. William Morgan, he completed his PhD in Aberdeen, Scotland, where he designed and implemented a water wall reintroduction. He joined the conservation evidence team in March 2020 to deliver a global synopsis of reptile conservation. And he has since been actually exploring different approaches to using and presenting evidence for conservation challenges. Nico has joined the Foundation of Success in 2016. He is the co-director of Foundation of Success Europe since 2018, and he has also co-led this conservation learning initiative together with myself. So without further ado, please, Nico and Will, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlotte. And I will dive straight in. What we have been doing in this initiative is we have been building on previous work of many of the people you just saw presented by Charlotte in different papers, and many years of thinking to actually put together a 5-step approach that we think is pretty practical and fairly hands-on for what we're trying to do, to actually use evidence to test key assumptions and answer learning questions in conservation. And Will and I will take you through all these steps now in the following slides. To start with the first one, if you want to learn something, it might sound obvious, and it's also pretty obvious. You need a learning topic. You need to define a bit what you want to learn about. And obviously, you want to define there who the learning might be interesting for, also why you think the learning you're embarking on is essential, and frame a bit what you're actually trying to find out. Probably obvious stuff. The challenge is, depending on context, that exercise can be a bit of an art as well. So if you have a team that has a pretty well set kind of portfolio of work or a very clear strategy that it's implementing since a long time, and that's what you want to learn about, you might have your learning topics straight away, and it's basically nothing you have to think about for a long time. If you have a wide portfolio, lots of different options that you could learn about and have the intention that you want to start tipping into your evidence to start learning, then the starting point is slightly different. And then, as I said, it can be a bit of an art to actually find out what it is you want to focus on. That was a bit the case with MAVA's treasure of 30 years of conservation data, where we had that vast portfolio of almost 1,700 records in a database, and we somehow needed to find feasible conservation actions that we can learn about across all of these grants, with an amount of evidence that allows us to make an evidence synthesis, obviously. So what we did is we looked at all of them and basically took note of the different actions that were taken, clustered them, and then also clustered them further into 99 strategies that were pretty similar in terms of the approach that was taken. Building on that, we actually took these and clustered them again against the standard classification for conservation actions to have even bigger buckets with a high volume of evidence in it. From there, we looked at what kind of evidence do we actually have. So we made a quick scan for, how much evidence is really available. Did our assumption hold that the more grants we have that would potentially have data on this, the more evidence we have as well? For 4 of the 5 topics we found, that held true. So we kicked out one and we landed on 4 topics that we found interesting to learn about and that we also thought were relevant for the conservation community, and that MAVA shares some of the learnings and insights from its long grant-making experience. And these are capacity building, partnerships and alliances, flexible funding, and also research and monitoring. For the sake of this presentation, we're going to focus on capacity building, and we're going to do 2 things. We're using it as a case to explain the approach, but obviously also share all the findings that we have for capacity building in particular. Please keep in mind that we're focusing here on training and individual capacity building development. So we're not looking into other forms of capacity building here. That said, there are 2 other learning topics in this initiative that actually have a pretty clear connection to other forms of capacity building as well, which is flexible funding and also partnerships and alliances. And I encourage you to look at these, obviously, if you're interested in that. So second step, developing learning questions, tying into a lot of the things that were mentioned by Bill and Nick, that the unit of learning is a conservation actions. There are all kinds of conservation actions, but often the fundamentals of them are similar, and similar learning questions can matter for different cases where these actions are applied. That is basically the principles on which we have built on to find learning questions. And we recommend to use a theory of change to spell out how does actually the pathway from the action to the outcomes and impact that you're ultimately after look like. And I'd like to take you through the simplified version of the theory of change that we have made for capacity building. So if we're assuming you're doing training and capacity development, then obviously what you're after at one point is that the conditions for successful training are in place. So you have training needs identified, trainers, you have high potential trainers and trainees and so on. If that is the case, sufficiently trained people apply their skills. And that is the case on the one hand, if these people stay in business, they stay in the key organizations, but also if appropriate conditions to apply these skills are met. If that is the case, we're hoping to improve practice. And if that is the case, then we think we can achieve outcomes. Improving practice obviously can mean either conservation efforts becoming better, but also behavior of key stakeholders that we want to influence improves. So if that is the theory of change that explains how that capacity building effort normally works, then you can tie learning questions and assumptions to this. So, and we have found 4 that we wanted to zoom in on. On the far right of this chain, one key question we found was, do trained people implement better strategies or practices than untrained people, right? So if you make the effort of training, does that actually change practice to the positive? And the assumption we associated with that is, yes, trained people implement strategies and actions more effectively. That's what we want to test with evidence. We had another question about, do trainees actually apply the skills that they learn? And if they don't, why is that the case? Our assumption we wanted to test was, trainees apply their skills in their ongoing work. We asked the question, which skill deficits do organizations identify? And the assumption we want to test was, organizations know what actions and associated skills are required to carry out good practice. And lastly, do trained people stay with their organization or in the sector? And our assumption we wanted to look into was, trained people stay with their organization for at least 5 years after the training. So the point here is, we've built a framework to understand what is the action really about, to anchor learning questions in that really matter to understand how this action really works, and how we can improve our practice there. Based on that, we formulated assumptions to test with evidence, and we'll take you through the steps of collecting, assessing, and also compiling the evidence that we have used, and how that worked. Handing over to you, Will.
Great, thanks a lot, Nico. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of keep going through this process. We're going to talk about collecting, assessing, and then touching a bit on kind of compiling that evidence. So if we dive right into collecting evidence, I think if you're going to start collecting evidence, you need to answer a few key questions. So the first one of those is, what counts as evidence? And so we took a definition of what counts as evidence as similar to sort of the one that I think Nick introduced earlier. So evidence is relevant data, information, knowledge, and wisdom that can be used to assess one or more assumptions that relate to a question of interest. And so just a sort of reminder that here, an assumption is something that we believe to be true about the world. And again, the key is that we consider our evidence in relation to these assumptions. So we might think about the world as being kind of full of information that could be potentially drawn upon to kind of answer questions or to test assumptions in this way. So where do we search for our evidence in this world of potential evidence pieces? Well, firstly, we looked within the MAVA domain. And we did this in a couple of ways. So we engaged directly with MAVA grantees through sending out some questionnaires, but also through some more kind of detailed discussions and focus groups. We also read lots of reports. We dived in depth and kind of read through all of these reports, looking for key quotes, key findings, the opinions of the people that wrote those reports. We're kind of aware, though, that within this MAVA domain, there's lots of self-reported evidence. There's lots of people providing their own opinions of how things went, giving their own assessments of successes and failures. So we kind of wanted to sort of spread the net a bit wider, and also have a look in the wider literature as well. And again, we did this in a couple of ways. Firstly, we looked in the Conservation Evidence database. So for those of you that don't know, this is a database of documented evidence, all about the effects of conservation actions. And we were actually able to search this database systematically using sort of keywords that related to our topics of interest. We then finally cast the net sort of as wide as we possibly could and turned to Google and Google Scholar for exploratory searches of what was really out there in the wider literature. And so where we found lots of evidence, we really tried to focus on sort of large reviews, meta-analyses, large-scale studies like that. And then when we came across less evidence from our searching, we tried to turn to sort of some experts in the field and have discussions with them and allow them to kind of help guide our searching and find maybe key sources that we'd missed. And it's worth noting, you know, we're well aware that this was not a systematic search of the kind of broader literature. It'll be fantastic to do a systematic search, but we think we took a pretty pragmatic approach, kind of given the limitations that we had in terms of time and resources and things like that. And so then what did we actually use as evidence? So we had responses to questionnaires, we had financial data, we had results and findings from papers, articles, we had quotes and extracts from reports, and then we had maybe conclusions from our discussion groups. So you can see this as a real mix of different types of evidence. It's a really wide cross-section. We've got qualitative stuff, we've got quantitative things, we've got objective data, we've got subjective opinions. So it's a really broad spectrum of stuff that we kind of wanted to bring all together to assess those assumptions. So that kind of leads us nicely onto the next point, which is how do we assess evidence when it's so diverse, when it covers so many different types? And the approach that we took to this is to assess each piece of evidence individually based on a few criteria. So the first thing to look at is what we call the degree of support. Does the evidence support or does it refute our assumption? The next bit is the weight of the evidence. This is going back to Bill's cube. We looked at a couple of aspects of that cube. So just two of those axes. We were interested in the relevance and then reliability, or what Bill referred to as the quality of the information. So let's dive into those in a bit more depth now. So degree of support. Does the evidence indicate that the assumption is true, false, or is it kind of a mix of both? And if true, how strong is that support? So let's take this example assumption. Trainees apply their skills in their ongoing work. So if a piece of evidence finds that trainees apply their skills, then we find support for the assumption. If we find that trainees aren't applying their skills, then that evidence refutes the assumption. So let's look at a couple of examples. We've got a meta-analysis of 70 studies found that managerial training led to moderate changes in on-the-job behavior. So we've got some changes in behavior following training, but they were described as moderate. So we might say that that provides some support for the assumption. Another example is a controlled before and after study in 4 neighborhoods found that household visits did not increase the use of wildlife-resistant dumpsters. So we've not found any change in a particular kind of behavior or skill, no difference before and after. So this piece of evidence refutes. It's worth noting that whether an evidence supports or refutes your assumption is really about the specific wording of your assumption. We could have said, we said trainees use their skills, apply their skills. We could have worded it as trainees do not use their skills, or trainees use their skills in the morning, but tend not to in the afternoon. And that would obviously impact on what our evidence is telling us about supporting or refuting assumptions. It's just a key point, I think, to note that, you know, be really careful with your wording, because that is really the key thing here. And now we'll move on to the weight of the evidence. So this is the cube. This is the cube, our kind of block of evidence. So how much emphasis are we placing on a piece of evidence? And we used kind of these 2 measures to help us decide on that. So we've got the relevance and reliability. So we can think of relevance about the finding and about the context in which that finding was found. So how closely does that match with the assumption that we're interested in? So for example, a study that found intentions to use a skill Well, we'd have to make an additional assumption that those intentions to use a skill actually resulted in skill use. So we might give that lower weight, say, than a study that recorded actual skill use. The next aspect is this reliability, which is really the extent to which we believe and trust the findings. And we can ask questions like, were appropriate methods used? Were potential biases acknowledged and accounted for? And were there appropriate counterfactuals? And so let's look at our examples again. So we've got a meta-analysis of 70 studies. It's all about training, it's on-the-job behavior. So we judge this to have high weight. Our second example, a controlled before-after study. So a fairly rigorous design, but just in 4 neighborhoods. So we might like to have seen more neighborhoods there. And then actually, this is about household visits. So it's about trying to change a behavior, to try and get uptake of a new behavior, but this isn't maybe really a really kind of in a training context. So we would judge that to have lower weight, as it's not quite so relevant. So the next step is really to bring these two things together. So we've got our degree of support and weight. So from example 1, we had some support and we had very high weight. So that leaves us with a block of evidence showing some support, a big heavy block of evidence with some support. For our second example, we were refuting the assumption and it was a medium amount of weight. And so we got a sort of medium-sized block of refuting evidence. And so then what we can do with that is compile all of our pieces of evidence together. This is kind of the next key stage. Bring everything together so we compile our evidence and we can draw our conclusions. Now, one way to sort of conceptualize the spread of evidence is kind of like almost like a seesaw or a balance, where you've got your refuting pieces on one side and you've got your support on the other side. And then we can just imagine stacking our evidence pieces on top of each other. So we've got the examples that we started with, and then we've got all of our refuting evidence, our mixed support, some support, and then finally our strong support. And we can actually start to use this plot to help draw conclusions. So we can look at the number of pieces of evidence that we've got, or we could look at the weight of the evidence in each category. Or we could start to look at the distribution of that evidence. So here we can see that we've got quite a lot of green and light green evidence, not much yellow and very little red. And then finally, we could look at where the balance of that evidence lies. And so we could say, well, this is the balance point. This is the kind of average support that we're finding from all of our evidence. So that's how you can kind of use a plot like this, which we've called these ziggurat plots. Like this sort of stepped temples in a way. But I'll hand back to Nico and he can sort of talk you through some of the actual conclusions that we were able to draw about this learning topic.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Will. Perhaps just adding one more aspect to the drawing conclusions that is not necessarily always relevant. We found it relevant actually, especially in the light of combining evidence from the MAVA domain and from outside the MAVA domain, was that we also differentiated again, although we were stacking everything, we differentiated evidence by source again, or at least provide the possibility to do so also on the website. So you find all these ziggurat plots for all these assumptions there, and you can also always differentiate by source. Sometimes that really helps to understand, is the published outside MAVA domain evidence more balanced than the other evidence from inside MAVA? What could be the reasons for that, and so on. So for the step of drawing conclusions and formulating lessons learned, it can be important to do that. Obviously, if you work with a case where you have lots of different sources of evidence, that probably doesn't really help. And the whole point is you want to stack it and put it together and get a joint conclusion. So what do we learn? That's obviously the key question here. So let's dig a bit into the findings on capacity building. I'll take you back to this theory of change that you have seen before, and I'll go through it learning question by learning question and try to share a bit what we think, the evidence is telling us in terms of lessons learned. If we go to the far right of this diagram here again, and this question about does it actually improve practice, then it seems evidence is suggesting that that's the case, that people that are trained actually implement better practice. That said, the outcomes of individual training interventions can vary immensely from complete success to utter failure. So therefore it is, not sending the right signal to just think, yes, that's the case. It depends how you design your capacity building interventions. And it depends on a lot of things that actually have to do with the beginning of this diagram. So I want to take you through that as well. And there's lots to learn from evidence from other fields as well that we have put in the mix in our evidence assessment. So let's go to the next question. Do trainees actually apply their skills? And if not, why? Also here, the evidence does suggest that trainees often apply their learned skills. And again, it depends on a few key factors. And these key factors are actually represented in this diagram here, in this theory of change. It depends on the one hand on the trainee characteristics, and it depends on the design and implementation of the capacity building interventions. And secondly, it depends on the work environment, the context under which these trained people are supposed to apply their skills on the opportunity, on the resources, and so on. A few things about that. There's research from really decades of industrial and organizational psychologists for for these contributing conditions here, and I go into the top box here first. So what are the conditions to apply? It's proven that if people don't apply their skills, they lose them, and it goes really quickly. So if there's no way to tie a capacity building investment in some kind of follow-up and actual application, it can very easily be a disinvestment. A key thing that plays a role is support both from peers and also from leadership in the work context. And support can take different shapes and forms. It can be encouragement and motivation. It can be technical guidance and advice. And it can be direct help, resources, and assistance. All these things play a key role, both from peers and from leaders in the work context. And then lastly, you have to keep up the motivation of people to apply their skills. And that happens mainly through keeping let's say, the individual cost for application low. That means it must not be on top of everything. You have to do over hours in order to apply the newly learned skills. It has to be something that is supported, where you get resources for, where you get time allocated for. And another key thing, where the ambition level is not too high. So where you can do things at the outset that you can realistically handle with these new skills. Then going to the first box here, training and design of training conditions for training. Pre and post training measures really matter. For pre-training, it matters the individuals that you select, because many individuals come with preset ideas if they want to apply skills or not. There are different motivations to be in a training in the first place. It matters who you select, and it matters how that falls into place for that person and also the organization that person comes from. Secondly, post-training, it has to be part of the training program, what happens after the training. And at the end of a training, there should be some kind of planned follow-up for, I'm writing my own guidance as a trainee to myself, how I'm going to apply that stuff in my own reality. I make that reflection already when I leave the training, and I have follow-up with the trainers months or sometimes years later to actually follow up on that, look in it, and try to bring it into practice and discuss it. That's one example for that. Another key point here to keep in mind, if it's about maintaining skills, it's important that block courses are a lot less effective than training that is spread over longer durations, spaced out over longer timeframes, and also interleaved with actually ongoing practice. That it has a much higher effectiveness with regards to maintenance and retention of skills. So that might be something to keep in mind as well if you're investing in capacity building efforts. Lastly, we have too little data. So there is little evidence actually on what happens after training efforts. That is true for other sectors, but also for the conservation sector. And it would be really good to invest more in this. And also it is a black box, what happens between training and the either implementation or non-implementation of skills. So it would be really good to actually get a bit of data and evidence about that. Which skills and skill deficits have been identified? MAVA grantees have focused on 3 key audiences: biodiversity and protected area managers and staff in environmental NGOs and also community-based organizations. And the main focus of capacity building was biodiversity and conservation management, monitoring methods and tools, and also climate change. It is important to keep in mind that we don't know from our evidence if that's based on a needs assessment. And I want to emphasize that as well. All the evidence we looked at says needs analysis before training makes a huge difference. You should look at what needs to be trained, who needs to be trained, and in which context is this training later on applied. And lastly, do people stay with their organization? We have mixed support for the assumption that that happens. And however, we cannot draw any strong conclusions. There was little evidence available here. It's important to differentiate between people that stay in organizations or in the sector. And actually, while looking at the evidence, we felt like we might have asked the question slightly in the wrong way, because what matters is if people, it's perhaps even good if they succeed and get other job and so on, as long as they apply valuable skills and bring them into practice and actually make a change that could be even beneficial if they change organizations. So perhaps on the one hand, the question might be asked in the wrong way. Another point here is we learned from the evidence that a key thing for the conservation sector, why people are leaving, is lack of progression in the jobs. So it might really be something for us to think about how we can ensure possibilities for progression in order to keep talent and people that we trained in things. So these are the findings for capacity building. And with that, I think I hand over to you, Charlotte. Perhaps I encourage everybody to dig into the details on the website, obviously, for a lot more than I said now. But Charlotte, I think we're going into a Q&A or something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nico. And thanks, Will, really for this very interesting presentation. I think that we are getting a lot of questions. We won't be able to answer all those. Maybe we could see there is an interesting one here from Gunilla Kuperus, asking whether through the focus on defining the learning questions, you are missing on learning by accident. For instance, learning from brilliant failures. Does someone want to say a few words on that? I don't know. Will, Nico?
Yeah, Will, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, I can say a couple of words. I'm just sending a response to the chat, which has gone now from the question from Tobias. I thought this was a really interesting question, and I think I don't have a kind of the overall answer to it. I just think it's a really nice thing to bear in mind that sometimes you make discoveries where you're kind of least expecting. I think the real strength of the approach here is that it gives you some structure and it allows you to kind of take these kind of logical steps. I think we've discovered along the way a number of things that we would love to explore more. And I think that you're always going to find these kind of interesting kind of nuggets of information when you dive deeply into something like this. Yeah, I think laying out the logic of your learning questions in this way is bound to throw up new interesting ideas for you to explore, and it's kind of great. Will be great to kind of explore some of those in the future as well. So yeah, I mean, it's just a lovely idea. These kinds of accidental discoveries.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We wanted also to have a poll. I don't know whether the question has been already asked. We wanted really to know from you how you or your organization work with evidence to learn and to improve your practice. So you have, the choice between all those questions, whether you have a systematic workflow to learn from, or whether you have data but don't really know how to work with them, whether you don't have any good data, and so on. So please just answer, and then we will see what we get from that poll. I think we should actually we got also some other very interesting questions, but I'm afraid we won't be able to address all of those. For instance, people are asking what was the most important new insight on how individual capacity building works should be approached, and so on. But I think this is really I think it's a very interesting, and general questions actually that we could address maybe at the end to try to understand. And I think in the next session, where we will have some reflections from Julien and Daniela, we will be also able to get also some response on that. So I would like, you can see maybe the results from the poll. It looks like it's a bit mixed. We do have actually about 25% who already have a systematic workflow to learn from evidence. 33% have data but don't really know how to work with them. I hope this session will encourage you and motivate you to try and to start looking at evidence-based learning. And some people also don't have good data to work with. So you see, I think it looks like we really have here some opportunity to start looking at learning. So I would like actually to go to the next session, but I would like first to apologies. I forgot to introduce Lauriane Bess and Sarah Estlender from FOS, who are really taking care nicely of the technical aspects of this webinar and who are ensuring that everything is going well. So we want to have some reflections from people on this, from key people on this topic. We would like to hear from Daniela. Daniela is she works at Foundation of Success Europe. Daniela Aschenbrenner. She's also a trained conservation coach, and today she's here. Is Daniela? Hello. Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Daniela, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. So I don't know if it was my connection. So I wasn't sure what you said about me. So yeah, my name is Daniela, and I wanted to say that today I'm here as a member of CCNet Europe. CCNet Europe, we are the European regional network of the Global Conservation Coaches Network. I can actually see that a lot of CCNet members are present in this meeting. I think that is fantastic. And as I'm sharing my own reflections here, I think it would be fantastic to have a follow-up discussion within our network about what this all means for us. So for those who don't know CCNet, we are a voluntary network of coaches. And we train individuals as conservation coaches who can then help teams or projects to apply adaptive management to their work. And in Europe, we also provide basic training on adaptive management for conservation practitioners. And as an organization, we do this because we believe that evidence-based conservation and adaptive management can help to increase conservation impact. I think that for us as a capacity building organization, the result of this initiative and this work is really valuable when thinking about how we can improve our practice, make our trainings more effective. And yeah, I would like to share some reflections with you. So on the next slide, you can actually see again the simplified theory of change for the capacity building learning topic. And when I compared it to our own theory of change, to CCNet Europe theory of change, I found it very interesting to see that there are major overlaps. So we share the same key assumptions that trained people apply their skills, and for this they implement better practices, which then leads to an increased conservation impact. As a capacity building organizations, we also have strategies to ensure that conditions for successful training, so the blue box on the left side, are in place. So for example, that we have well-trained trainers of coaches and high quality training materials. And one last point on the theory of change. So looking at the box on the top that talks about appropriate conditions to apply skills. So I thought that it's very interesting that at least at the moment, we don't have a very strong focus on how organizations support our trainees after the training, but we do have a strategy to provide mentoring and peer support to our trained coaches within our community to actually help them to decrease the burden in applying their skills, because they can, for example, exchange with the fellow coaches about their experiences. Yeah, so seeing this major overlap between the two theories of change, I thought it was also then very exciting to look at the learning questions and the findings of this work. And as CCNet Europe, we have in the past not formulated explicit learning questions, but I think I can confirm that the learning questions from this work are relevant for us as a capacity building organizations, and that we actually also discuss them, and some probably more intensively than others. And I will now reflect separately on each question. So I start with the first one, that is about if trained people actually implement better strategies and practices. Nico, can you click one time so the question appears? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this question, that's of course the holy grail for us. This is what we want to achieve, but so I think we know very little about this because we have never systematically collected data. So we do receive feedback from our trainees that the skills they have learned have helped them in their work, or that they provided a benefit to their projects or organizations. But I think it would be helpful to understand this question much better than we do now. Yeah, and maybe even collect data and assess this together with other capacity building organizations. Then for the next question, B, that asks if trainees apply the skills in their work. That is a key question for us. And looking at our list of trainees, so in Europe, I think we can assume that between 30 to 40% of our trainees, depending on the target group, use their skills with different intensity. So we have some who rather apply it more sporadically, but then we have also up to a group that has fully integrated the skills into their work. And I thought it was interesting, if I look at this, that it seems that the level of application is very often connected to the organizational support our trainees have. I think there is room for improvement for us. So in that more of our trainees apply their skills in the work, and maybe also even on a more regular basis. And yeah, so what I've heard from Nico, I thought it is very interesting, and there's a lot of interesting learning that we can take into account when we actually think about how we can make our training more effective. And there are 3 points that I would like to highlight. So 3 examples for our work. And yeah, so at one point we discussed internally if we want to provide guidance to our trainees on how to create and grab coaching opportunities after a training. And yeah, so I think at the moment that it might be very important to reconsider this again, doing this again, as opportunities to apply skills seems one of the determining factors of long-term skill application. Then secondly, I think it might be useful that we check in a bit more intensively on the motivation, job relevance, and the organizational support of our trainees. So on the one hand, that we can maybe select candidates a bit more strategically, but also to better understand the context of our trainees and to support them in a better way. And then my third point here is that we have never really focused on systematically implementing post-training activities or follow-up. So I think as an organization, we know very little about what is happening after our trainings and why. Yeah, and again, hearing what has been shared before, I think it is really important that we get a hold on this and discuss internally if yes, how we want to establish a more structured post-training follow-up. And again, I think on this question, it would be very interesting to exchange and learn from it with other capacity building organizations about what has worked and what not. Then moving on to the next question, that was about the skill deficits that organizations identify, or the assessment of training needs. So yes, this understanding the training needs of our community is relevant to us. We have grown a lot as a network of coaches, and we now have a different level of skills and experiences present. So last year we collected data on the training needs of our members, and I think it has been very helpful for us in directing the discussions on how we can adjust our training offer to our community. I am actually not sure how relevant it is to exchange on that question between different organizations, because I felt that at least for us, it is very specific to our context, and that we also collect the data within our own community. So this might be different for pure or for other capacity building organizations who train individuals or groups that they don't know so well. And then the last question, the learning question number D, is do trained people stay with their organization or in the conservation sector? So especially looking at the group of trained coaches in Europe, I think we can see that many of them stayed with the organization for a long time, and certainly most of them stayed in the sector. And again, it seems that the support of organizations in which coaches work plays a key role in this. So I think it's so like this, the conditions to be able to apply this skill is really something that I think we should take into consideration. Yeah, and Nico, you have already raised this question if leaving an organization is actually always bad. So I agree, leaving the sector for sure, because then the skills are lost. But I think from experience, I can say that in CCNet Europe, we have seen negative examples, but I think we have also many positive examples when people changed an organization, because it impacted the level or increased the level on how they could apply the skills actually, or the reach of the application was increased. I do recognize that for organizations who try to get their staff trained, this might be different. But I think for us it has, let's say both, so the positive and the negative side. Okay, then coming to an end, I can say three things so that I feel pretty inspired to see if we can focus our data collection even more on key questions. And I hope that others in our network feel the same. I realized that some of the bigger but really relevant questions, so learning questions A and B, maybe are easier to answer if we combine evidence from other capacity building organizations together with our own data. And I can also imagine that CCNet Europe would benefit from a joint learning process with other capacity building organizations instead of learning in isolation. So that's from my side. I can say thank you very much for this fantastic work, and thank you very much for your attention. And I hand over to Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniela. Really nice to see that this work was also useful for you, for CCNet, and that you think there is an opportunity to work and on this together with the others. I would like now to introduce Julien Semelin. Julien Semelin is from Cartier Nature. He is actually, he has been working in nature conservation for more than 20 years. Most of the time in the philanthropic sector. He joined Cartier for Nature a year ago, and he is working to develop this new corporate foundation committed to the protection and the restoration of ecosystems for the benefit of people and nature. I'm so glad to welcome you, Julien, a former colleague and friend. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Just if you noticed, indeed, my name in the Conservation Learning Initiative team is just because I was with the MAVA Foundation team a year ago, and I was at the launch of the initiative, and I left along the way, and I'm really pleased today to participate to the webinar under the umbrella of the new foundation I'm working with, which is Cartier for Nature. And I'm going to bring, let's say, the perspective of a funder to the Conservation Learning Initiative, but let's say generally more on the evidence-based conservation. So not only on the capacity building topic, but let's consider working with evidence from the funder side. Just a few words about Cartier for Nature first. We are a new corporate foundation created in 2020 and 100% funded by the Maison Cartier. So, but we are an independent foundation based in Switzerland. And as Charlotte just said, our mission is to help protect and restore biodiversity and ecosystems. So we give grants to non-profit organizations around the world. So as a new funder, there are two things that occupy our mind every day. First, we want to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel. And second, that in this context of biodiversity and climate crisis, and with the urgency to act, we provide funding support to initiatives that have an impact at scale. So how to ensure that we are funding sound and impactful conservation actions? So the very first thing we want to make sure is that every conservation action we support is based on good science. And we have the chance that knowledge exists. We have decades of publication and research that could inform our partners on the effectiveness of a specific action. For instance, is thinning trees preventing wildfire, or marking power lines is reducing the incidental bird mortality? We have those responses. And we have a great tool that summarizes the evidence and makes it accessible, which is the Conservation Evidence Program of the University of Cambridge. And we had the presentation from Bill earlier. So there is no excuse. And as a funder, the very first thing we do is to check that the proposal is relying on the evidence. The second thing is that we also want to make sure that the conservation action we are going to support will trigger the expected change and we have an impact on biodiversity and ecosystems, and that this impact can be measured and demonstrated. For instance, if we train a community of fishers to use circle hooks, are they going to use them? Is it going to reduce the bycatch of sea turtles? Is it going to have an impact on the sea turtle population? So in other terms, we want to understand the theory of change, make sure that there are smart objectives, and there is a plan for adaptation. And we also have great tools for that exist for many years now, and this is the conservation standards, for instance, that I'm sure you all know. So therefore, as a funder, we pass proposals that we review through these two lenses, the conservation evidence, the conservation standards, and this really helps us to form an opinion on the viability of a proposed conservation strategy. But then there is one question that remains. Does someone else have already implemented such conservation strategy in the world? What did they learn? Could we get something out of it that could improve the initiative that we are considering right now? And there is for sure a good similar project somewhere in the world on which we could learn. And we have decades of successes and failures in conservation, and we have to learn from it. So we already addressed these questions, of course, but this is mainly through opinions given by experts or consultations among funders, or the participation to thematic discussions or reading reports. So this is all about gathering experience, but for instance, there is the risk of bias linked to personal opinions or specific context. Therefore, I think that an initiative like the Conservation Learning Initiative has the potential to become a very powerful tool as it responds to these questions on a more systematic manner and as it relies on a solid process, as we have just heard about. Moreover, for funders, I can also see another added value. Assessing the evidence around specific conservation strategies has the potential to gather communities of practice around these conservation issues. Indeed, as a funder, we are deeply concerned about scaling the impact of our investment. And if a specific project that we support has an impact somewhere in the world, but then that the learnings can be widely shared with the community and that it can also trigger an impact in other parts of the world, it's really scaling even more the impact of our funding support and truly participating to a global effort. So as a conclusion, for us, this initiative is timely, first because we are just starting our journey and we can benefit from a tremendous 30 years of experience from the MAVA Foundation, but also from other organizations which could join the initiative right now. This is also timely because with this urgency to act, I also personally witness a desire of collaboration from all the organizations I meet, and this initiative can help such collaborations to materialize. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I am really happy to respond to any questions. And over to you, Charlotte.
Yes, thanks a lot, Julien. Very, very, let's say, inspiring. We understand the urgency to act, and also the fact that Cartier for Nature is really keen to apply evidence-based conservation in their work. So this is encouraging. I would like to see whether we do have questions to our panelists. I don't see any questions. I wanted maybe us to launch the poll because we do have a few questions here we want to ask you. Are there learning questions that you or your organization need answered to achieve the impact you want? And I see that in the meantime, my dear former colleague Marco Pekarevic has also asked a question here. Marco is asking how to balance best fit with best practice. How to balance best fit with best practice. I'm really curious to know who would like to start with answering this question. I don't know whether this was addressed to the two last panelists or to anyone, but please feel free, whoever feels, inspired to answer this question, would like to start. Maybe we have 1 or 2 minutes for that.
I think for all panelists, a clarifying question, Marco. Best fit in terms of best fit for the organization that is implementing, or can you clarify that?
Very good. This is exactly. Is it best fit of also the kind of I don't know whether it's capacity building or in general or on evidence-based conservation practice for the context we are talking about. Okay, so best fit for the context we are talking about, including organizational setup. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
I think this is really interesting. And we, in looking at the evidence and looking at what to apply, we think that there's a number of elements of that. And the key one is the balance between what the evidence says and your values. So what you care about and what is practical for your organization. So something might be a very good idea, but it's just impractical or goes against other values. And you need to combine all of those. So it's not the case that there's one answer as to what the best thing to do is. It's a decision that has to be made by the practitioner by balancing those different components. And the book tells you how to do that.
Thank you. Can we see? Yeah, we've got the results from the poll. So are there any learning questions? It's yes, but unfortunately, we don't know which learning questions are there. So at least this shows us the interest for the topic and also the interest to work with that. So we only have 2 minutes left before the end of this webinar. I would like to thank everyone who has really participated in this. I first would like to thank the audience, for being with us. I would like also to thank the panelists for your inspiring presentations. Really, really nice to hear about this. I want to say that there are many more information about these initiatives in the report. So you can find the report online. You can please do dig into the report. Please share also your insights and your questions. Any suggestions you have, you are able to contact the Conservation Learning Initiative team on the email address you see there. And I think that there are also other products that were actually published on this one. Besides the report, there are a few blogs that will be coming out. One was already released on capacity building. And then I think there will be other blogs on the other themes of the top of the initiative, flexible funding, and also on partnerships and alliances. And there was also another blog on research and monitoring. So very, very interesting. Thank you very much to everyone. And I hope we keep in touch and keep working together on this. Thank you very much.